Welcome back to the Just Jesus podcast. Thank you for joining me again today. Episode 4. That's right, count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. We've made it this far. If you are new to the Just Jesus podcast, great to have you today. If you are returning back and you've made it to episode 4, congratulations, you've made it this far. And thanks for joining again today. And if you're new again to the Just Jesus podcast, it is simply put just that. It's just Jesus. We're not really getting into theology or doctrine or anything pertaining to church. I believe there is a time and place for that. But here on this podcast, it's just Jesus, as the title sort of gives away, right? We talk about Jesus, and we're talking about all the aspects of Jesus, not just who he was, but who he is today, how that affects our lives, how that changes us today, how that still has relevance in our world today. And we're kind of looking at that from all angles. So if you are someone who is on a journey to know Jesus and desiring to know Jesus, or you've been on a journey with Jesus for a long time, I believe there is something in this podcast every week that will help you and challenge you and continue to help you to grow in your knowledge of who Jesus is. So if you're just starting off, we're going to help you with that. And if you've been doing this for a long time, like me, been doing this for 40 years, I believe that there is something that you will get out of today as well. So we're just talking about Jesus. And the amazing thing is when you talk about Jesus, he kind of has a way of making himself relevant and known to whoever you are, wherever you are, and whatever you're going through. And so that's the exciting thing. But today, what we're going to get into a little bit, I tried to last week, and if you watched or listened to last week, you'll know how quickly I got sidetracked, unintentionally, but sidetracked nonetheless. And that was a desire last week to sort of talk about this idea of the real Jesus. Who is the real Jesus? And when I was described in sort of context last week, what the real Jesus was, and who Jesus was, the real Jesus, and why that's important for us to ask that question. And then we kind of grew from that, and we talked about sort of having a crisis of faith, and why having a crisis of faith is actually a good thing. We run from those things, but those are things actually that are very powerful in our lives and help shape our own journey. But I was attempting to get to this last week, and sort of we got, again, sidetracked. So here we go again. We're going to try to get into it today and stay focused on trying to get through this, because I started last week, and this is the point of this. And I'm going to get a little deeper into some historical and contextualization of the world that Jesus Christ came into. And I know for a lot of people, maybe history is not your cup of tea. Talking about these things, I might lose you, but I'm asking you to sort of stay focused today, because not that you need to be able to regurgitate the facts of the Roman Empire and the Jewish mindset of the day of Christ when Jesus was walking this earth, and why all that's important. There's no test at the end of this, but it is important for us because, again, to understand who we are as human beings, you have to look at that in the context of the world we are born into, right? I mean, if you were born here in America, you're shaped by the world you're in. You're shaped by the interaction you have with that world. If you were born in another country, or you're listening to us from another country, you are shaped by the culture in which you came into. And even nowadays, every generation is facing different geopolitical, economic, sociological issues that are shaping the generation that are facing different sort of tasks. And I mean, I've got 3 kids. I've got a 17-year-old now. My daughter just had a birthday, 17-year-old. I have a 14-year-old, and I have an 11-year-old. And I say to them all the time, the world, and I know this sort of like the old parent saying, right? It's kind of the obvious thing, but, I tell them, the world you guys are growing up in, I mean, I didn't have to grow up in a world like this. Which, on the other hand, if you're a parent nowadays, parenting is difficult, because we are facing tasks that are extremely difficult, not only for us to navigate as adults, but trying to help an adolescent teenager to navigate this is increasingly difficult. So I tell my kids all the time, that your world's being shaped. Studies have showed this. They're doing more and more research on all this and how social media and technology is shaping kids today, and how it's in a lot of ways, not to get on this today, but having a negative effect on kids today in an alarming way. I wonder in 50 years from now, we'll look back on this time in our lives and go, what were we thinking? Why did we do that? Because of the potential damage it's causing. But again, I revert not to talk about that. But the point is, my daughter was born in 2007. I believe the first iPhone was released in 2008. I might have missed that. I'm somewhere like that. I would Google it, but I don't want to get sidetracked. So she was born in 2007, February 2007. The first iPhone was introduced around that same time. So she is a part of the first generation that has grown up in a world that never knew what it was like not to have an iPhone. We all tell the war stories. Of what it was like to have, we had a car phone, right? And then, before that, the idea of a phone outside of your house was a foreign concept. And then inside the house, for a long time, you had the 17-foot long cord, so you could talk in a private room because everything had to be connected. And then they came out with phones that had, wireless inside the house where you could walk around without being attached. And we thought we were all like in Star Wars. Star Trek. At that point, the technology was amazing. And now my kids look at that like, that's so ancient to them. The point I'm making is the world we live in, the world we interact with, it says a lot about us. How we interact with that world says a lot. So today I want to dive into that a little deeper, into the world that Jesus came into and how he interacted with that world and what did that world look like. Because again, I say this all the time, context is king. When you're studying scripture, you're studying the things about God, context is king. If you take something out of the right context, you distort its meaning. So you have to see what was being said, what was being done within the context in which it was being said and which it was being done. But I want to frame it a little bit this way to kind of help bring a little more relevance, so we're not just talking about a bunch of non-connected historical facts. I want to frame it this way. Have you ever heard of the movie? It was actually an event, but they made it into a movie. I think George Clooney was in it, Mark Wahlberg. I'm trying to think who else was in it. I think I saw it one time. I don't remember. Don't take my recommendation on it. If you go watch it, it's a terrible movie or it has stuff that's offensive. I don't remember. I think I watched it on an airplane somewhere. I don't remember anything really about the movie other than the fact I did see the movie. And I remember the poster of the movie because it was a very sort of vivid poster. It's called The Perfect Storm. And it's actually based on a real life situation. And back in late October of 1991, there was a crew of a fishing boat called the Andrea Gale. And it was out of Massachusetts, and it went out into the Atlantic, and it found itself caught in sort of what was later dubbed the perfect storm. And basically what it was is there was a cold front that was moving along the Canadian border, and I don't want to get too meteorological, but it's important to kind of understand the context here. So there was this cold front moving along the Canadian border, and there was a high pressure system that was building over southwestern or southeastern part of Canada, and it was intensifying, and the low pressure that was coming, the locals call it the Halloween nor'easter. And then on top of that, you had this sort of converging. We have nor'easters now. I live in Maryland. If you're listening to this from somewhere else, I live in Maryland. And so we have these nor'easters that come where you have two different weather patterns that converge and create sort of, especially in the wintertime, we can actually get our best snow in the wintertime with these nor'easters. So I digress. So they had these two weather patterns, and the locals called it the Halloween nor'easter. But in addition to that, what made it the perfect storm was there was a Hurricane Grace, that was sort of dying, but it had made it up that far, and it was intensifying, and it was making this thing called the perfect storm. And right in the middle of that was the Andrea Gale, and it was hit by this ferocious wind and wave, and it was this incredible scene. You can see it kind of played out in the movie. They did a good job at sort of showing the magnitude of the moment, and it just kind of reduced the boat to just, kindle matchwood. It was just nothing Only small little pieces of the boat were ever found. And it was made famous because of this conversion of the three types of weather patterns hitting in this moment. And obviously the story of the Andrew Gale and sort of the tragic nature of that sort of brought it to light. But in similarity to that, we'll use that as a framework to talk about, because when you study and write about Jesus, he sort of faced the perfect storm of his own. When you mention Jesus, it kind of raises all kinds of winds and storms today even. And some people today even doubt if the events recorded in the Bible actually happened. And a lot of people have kind of reduced them to seeing them more like legends. And then they argue that modern science and history have shown that we can't believe such sort of lofty pie in the sky tales. But additionally to all that, they claim that these type people, these skeptics claim that the books about Jesus were written a long time after his death by people who wanted to sort of establish their own religious beliefs or gain power. And so you have all these sort of mixtures of winds. The Bible talks about winds of doctrine, all these different thoughts. And maybe you've heard some of the skeptics that kind of use all these things to even today to diminish who Jesus is. But on the other hand, you have the people that believe, and you have people that believe in Jesus and truly see him as the Son of God. And on that side, they argue that the Bible is the Word of God and it must be believed. And they also sort of argue that the miracles of Jesus were true and he was a miracle, and they believed the miracles were proof of his divine nature. And they look at the truth of the Gospels and they sort of stand on those truths of the Gospels, and they kind of use that to kind of push against this sort of modern skepticism and kind of push back against the role of suspicion. And so they use sort of like the idea of the framework of Scripture and maybe even traditions of the church that they belong to, miracles, and even Jesus himself. And they sort of see looking at Jesus from a historical complex as a sign of selling out to sort of the skeptics. But today I don't want to just sort of use that as a sellout. I really do believe that we can look at the perfect storm that Jesus entered into. And by looking at how he interacted and how he reacted and interacted in that storm, it really shows us not only about who he is, but also kind of how he is even framing who he is today. Because the Bible says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if we want to know who Jesus is today, we somehow have to look back how he was then, because he's the same. He hasn't changed. The world has changed. But in fact, I think if we look through this a little bit today, you're going to find the world hasn't really changed. The stories have changed. The powers, we've changed, sort of the characters have changed, but the narrative still it kind of remains the same. So let's look at this for a second, if we can, sort of the making of the first century storm. We talked about the perfect storm that happened in Massachusetts. Let's talk about sort of the making of the first century storm. And I love metaphors because they kind of help paint a picture, right? I love metaphors. And I love it too because Jesus knew that. And he kind of used metaphors. He called them parables, but he used these to sort of kind of illustrate his own teachings and to train and teach his own followers. He used metaphors. He called them parables. So I'm kind of using this metaphor of a perfect storm to kind of illustrate a little bit of what Jesus was facing. The great part, spoiler alert, he didn't end up like the Andrea Gale. So it looked like it at first, but 3 days later he rose again. But that's the punchline for another podcast. So let's talk about the perfect storm metaphor, but let's use the first century framework and Jerusalem sort of as the backdrop of this perfect storm in the first century. And the pressure that built up in the time of Jesus, it was all converging on Jerusalem. Jerusalem was sort of the epicenter of all these political and social pressures. This is where sort of if we could say it this way, maybe it's better saying this is where all the fault lines came together, sort of the tectonic plates, if you want to use that kind of analogy. All the tectonic plates that were shifting in the world, they sort of came together and converged in Jerusalem. And this is sort of why we need to go back to there to understand this character by the name of Jesus of Nazareth. Because it's sort of the real perfect storm. You know, the perfect storm, yeah, I mean, unless you read the book or you watched the movie, you would have never really known if you lived anywhere else outside of Massachusetts that this was the perfect storm. But this perfect storm was the real perfect storm. And it took place right when Jesus came onto the scene. And I don't believe that was by accident, right? God is the ultimate God of timing. And here's the problem when you start doing this. And I forgot my water today, so my throat's feeling a little dry. So if I cough a few times, I apologize. Try to do it off mic here so I don't, if you're listening to me in your earbuds, I'm not coughing in your ear. But the problem with a lot of times when we start to do this, and I know this is why a lot of people kind of shy away from this subject. So we're attacking it head on today. We're going right at it. Because the reason why is because it's tough to tell the story of Jesus in sort of a simple way. Because there are so many things happening at one time. There are so many characters that play a part in the story of Jesus. You know, we have the Mary Magdalenes. We have obviously the Peters. We have this guy named Pontius Pilate. Then we have the bad guy Judas. And they all sort of play a part in the story, and they kind of catch our eye, kind of increase the imagination of the depth of the story. And then when you put all those characters and all the plots and all the different political things going on, right in the middle, there's Jesus, and he towers over all of them. But he towers over all of them. And I thought, I was kind of, as I was going through preparing for today, was amazing about it when I thought about that kind of statement. He towered over everyone. And that was, he towered over everyone, but he didn't seem aloof. And when we start digging in more and more into this story of who Jesus is, that's something that just keeps coming back is he was somebody that was approachable. He was somebody that anyone, no matter who they were, could feel a connection to. I will say, pause for a moment. I know I couldn't do this today. I'm going to try to be a good boy today and just stay focused. But every once in a while, I just have to sort of say this. That's the problem with the way that modern Christianity and even religion has framed Jesus. They have framed him in a way that he seems aloof. Right? Here we are down here in our world suffering, and we're just trying to make it. We're trying to deal with the problems of today. And there's Jesus up on his throne in a distant, far off place we call heaven that we kind of think's there. We don't know it's there. It's up there somewhere. And we sort of have this imagination that Jesus is sitting on the throne, kind of lounged back, right? Kind of, maybe his legs are crossed, lounged back, relaxing and kind of going, it's tough down there, isn't it? Well, don't worry, I'm still here, and if you could just hang on, you'll make it with me in heaven. And that's sort of the framework we've kind of, that a lot of people have produced that are kind of put Jesus into. And when you study Jesus in the framework in which he existed, and we have the actual stories of how he interacted with other people, you see anything but that. He towered over everybody, walked in the room, he walked into a town, everybody stopped what they were doing to see him, but he never felt distant and aloof. But when we look at that, well, then we have to ask the question, which is sort of what we're talking about just Jesus today, was who was he? What was he about? More importantly, what was he trying to do? But even to a greater degree, and this is why it's not just about history today or a good lesson of ancient Israel. When we look at the questions of who is he and what was he about, what was he trying to do, we can't stop there, because the bigger question is, why should we care 2,000 years later? Why does it matter 2,000 years later that we're sitting here and you're taking time out of your life to listen to a podcast about Jesus? Why does it matter that we go back and we ask these questions? Why does it matter 2,000 years later. Can we just forget that part of the story and move on? But there's something greater here. Because when Jesus' closest friends, there's a story, and I don't have to get into this today, but there's a story in the Bible where Jesus was actually in a real storm on the Sea of Galilee. And his closest friends wake him up in the middle of this actual storm on the Sea of Galilee, and they have questions. They got legit questions. And I will tell you this today, if you're someone that's on a journey with Jesus, questions are not wrong. Sometimes we feel we sort of shy away from asking questions. You know, we kind of have this, well, we can't ask that. You can't ask if Jesus is real. That's sort of like, you can't ask Jesus, you know, do we make it all up? I said last week, and I don't want to get back into it. A crisis of faith is one of the most powerful formative things you can have in your life. So questions are great. And you know what? The people that were looking Jesus straight into the eyeballs, who could see him face to face, not people like us today, 2,000 years later, that are looking at Jesus with the framework of our own imagination and sort of in a blank space. These are people that are looking Jesus in the eyeball, and they have questions. It's okay if we have questions. So here he is asleep in the middle of this storm, and they wake him up. And by the way, just in case, there's some evidence to this, because the Sea of Galilee is still a dangerous place today. In fact, I saw a sign one time that it was on in a parking lot next to the Sea of Galilee, and the sign said, basically was warning people from parking their cars there, because in storm, it says giant waves could sweep over your parked car. Forgot how it was phrased, but that was sort of the gist of it. So when they wake Jesus up, the thing that's amazing to us in the story is Jesus isn't scared, right? And according to the story, he tells the storm to be quiet. If you've never read the story, I encourage you to go read it. Matthew chapter 8. It's actually in 3 different parts of the Bible. Matthew 8, Mark 4, Luke 8. And when he tells the storm to be quiet, voila, it actually listened, right? And later on, I believe that the story is told not only because it was an amazing story. I mean, come on, how cool is this story? Jesus is asleep. He wakes up, tells the story. He basically says, stop. And the storm just calms immediately. I mean, that's an amazing story. That's one of the reasons why it was retold later on. But there was another part of this because they saw it in something of a larger struggle, and they were using this as a larger picture. I think in some ways they were framing this as Jesus is in the storm of the Sea of Galilee, and he says peace, but also Jesus was in a larger storm as well. And really the story of Jesus is the story of a man in the eye of the storm. The storm of sort of like, maybe we say storm of history and culture and politics and piety. And in the middle of this, there were times it felt like Jesus may have been asleep. But he really wasn't asleep, because there were times he stood up in the middle of this storm and told the winds and the wave to stop. So this story about Jesus facing the storm on the Sea of Galilee, in some ways, I believe, was used by the writers of the gospel to show a bigger point. And that point was Jesus wasn't just facing a storm on the Sea of Galilee. He was facing a larger storm, and he was caught right in the middle. He was the bullseye right in the middle of the storm. I mean, come on, let's be honest. There are certain things we face in life that aren't that daunting, not because they're not scary situations, because we've been in far worse. I wonder if Jesus was asleep on the storm because he thought, fellas, if you think this storm's a problem, you have no idea what we're facing, and y'all have no clue what's about to happen. If you guys can't handle this little bit of wind and wave, you're never going to be able to handle when you're being persecuted, when you're being chased, when you're being imprisoned, and with the threat of death. If you guys can't handle this, man, you have no idea what's to come. Now, Jesus doesn't say that. That's maybe being a little too free with interpretation, but that's sort of a little bit of a quest here, right? So let's go back for a second and use the original metaphor we started with, right? The perfect storm off the coast of Massachusetts in 1991. So you had the wind from the west, you had the storm from the north, you had the hurricane from the south, And they all converged on the single point. And it was not the place to be. Not there. Anywhere but there. And the poor Andrea Gale was stuck right in the middle of that. And the story tells out that was not a good place to be. But let's take that and let's now move that to the story of Jesus and what it was like in the Middle East in the first century, where there was a gale, a storm, and a hurricane, and Jesus was caught in the middle of it all. And the first storm he was caught into, and again, this is where I personally enjoy this subject, but I know some of you, I'll lose you here in just a moment, but hang with me just for a second because it's important. The first storm that he moved into was the storm of the Roman storm. This was the storm that was blowing in from the west. And it was a big deal. I can't tell you how big of a deal this was. I know we look at the Roman story in the Gospels as sort of a backdrop. But if you were living in that day, it was not a backdrop. It was right smack in the middle, facing you every day you got up. It was a big deal. Rome was the new king of the hill, and everyone was talking about it. And at that point, Rome had been getting stronger and more important for a period of time. But 30 years before Jesus was born, Rome was a republic. And again, I'm going to say some things, and hopefully I don't lose you. I don't have time to go through all of this, what it means specifically, but Google it. I don't mean that to be funny, but I mean, you can Google it. But 30 years prior to Jesus, and there's a point to all this, but 30 years prior to Jesus, Rome was a republic. And they had sort of this cool system where nobody could have too much power. Sort of kind of like we have today in America, even though I guess that could be debated. And those who did have too much power didn't have it for long. And because of that, Rome had gotten rid of tyrants a long time ago, and they were sort of proud of this, the fact that they had no tyrants. They had this sort of checks and balances, so to speak. But in that, there's a guy comes along by the name of Julius Caesar, and he sort of messes everything up. I'm giving you a brief history of Rome really quickly here, but it's important. Again, Jesus chose to come during this period of time. I think it's important that we at least know a little bit about it. So Julius Caesar comes along, he messes everything up. And by the way, Caesar was just his family name. But Julius decided to make it the royal title from that day on. So you say Julius Caesar, I thought Caesar was the name of the emperors of Rome or the leader of Rome. It was, and it started with Julius Caesar. It's like Joel Wright takes over Rome, and from now on, everybody that leads Rome will be called the Right or Right. All hail Right. That's kind of, it's silly. I hope to God that'd be a terrible. Poor Rome, if that was the case. But using that, so Julius Caesar, everything become known as Caesar. He made it a royal title, and Julius Caesar was in the context of Rome, was a great military hero. He had won all these amazing fights and battles on the frontiers, and did the unthinkable. He brought back his army to Rome and took over. And in that, this is where it's important. This is a little nugget to paint the picture of the mindset, right? And you're like, oh, I don't care about all this. Here's why you should care. Because when he comes back to Rome and he brings his army and he takes over power, there were those that started to look at this as a divine act. They didn't just see Caesar as this fellow, Julius Caesar as this fellow, was on a power trip. There were some that started to look at him as it was a divine act. And in Rome, there was sort of this perfect storm brewing between the old and the new. And the traditional folks were mad, and they ended up killing him. But then Rome got into sort of this long and bloody civil war, which was eventually won by Caesar's adopted son, Octavian. And he took the title, Augustus, which means majestic, or it means worthy of honor. Again, you got to get this. I know it's silly. I know I'm losing some of you. Come back. Roll back in. Come back. Because here's the point. So here's the framework where this is the few years leading up to Jesus' arrival in the world. The Son of God. We look at that title like Jesus is the Son of God. Yeah, but he came into a world that had a lot of people vying for that title.
And one of them had already claimed the title, and that was Caesar kind of put himself up, and then the Civil War, and then his son Octavian comes along, gives himself the title of Augustus, and that means literally majestic or worthy of honor. By the way, do you know Augustus is where we get the term August? Because our calendar that we use all are Roman names. Mars for March. March for Mars. July is Julius, right? See that? See where I'm going with that? So, anyways, so Augustus means majestic or worthy of honor. This became the name or title of his successors too. And so here we go. Why was this important? Because he said his father, his adoptive father, Julius, would become fine. This meant that now this is the point. This meant that Augustus Octavian Caesar. By the way, Rome had cool names. Okay, I know they played, but I mean, I always thought it would be cool to have like a Roman name. I mean, my name is Joel Seth Ray. I mean, but that's a cool name, right? Augustus Octavian Caesar. I mean, come on, that would be a cool name. I mean, sort of like, I guess they call him Gustus. I don't know what they call him for, what would be his, shorten that. But I mean, come on, Julius Maximus Ritus. I know this sounds a little clunky, but it just sounds better. But anyways, so that meant Augustus Octavian Caesar was now officially, get this, drum roll. I don't have a drum roll sound effect, but here's the point to all this. He literally now holds the title within his name. He is declaring himself the Son of God. Yes, you're right. This is why it's important. That's why it's not just a history thing. Oh my God, I don't care about Rome. What does it matter? It matters because there was already a self-declared Son of God when the real Son of God shows up. So he declared himself, Augustus Octavian Caesar means Son of God, or son of the divine Julius. And if you ask anyone in the German, if you ask anyone in the Roman Empire, from Germany to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, who was the Son of God, there was one obvious answer, and they would have said it to you without hesitation. Who's the Son of God? They would have said Octavian. This was the world that Jesus steps into. This is why this is important. Jesus did not show up on the scene with no, sort of in a virgin world where no one knew anything about this. He showed up at a time where there was already a self-declared, and what was the chances of this happening right before Jesus enters the scene? This is happening. And so if you ask anybody, who's the Son of God? Any Roman citizen, who's the Son of God? They would have said, well, there's this guy in Nazareth that believes he's the Son of God. His name is Jesus. They'd have said Octavian. There's no discussion. And in fact, to not say that, to not have that distinction would have actually been considered an atheistic viewpoint. So if you're a Roman citizen, they ask you who the Son of God is, and your answer wasn't Octavian, you were considered to be an atheist, which then made you an enemy of the state. So in a world where religion was a part of the state, now get this is where it gets bigger because it all has now you're starting to see the picture come together, right? We have Caesar, who then people say is divine. They end up killing him. His adopted son takes over. He gives himself the title of Augustus, Octavian Caesar, which literally means Son of God. And because the Roman religion was a state religion, voila, guess what? Augustus now becomes the chief priest. And he passed that job on to his successors too. And in addition to that, his poets and his historians, Augustus's own court, his poets, every leader had its own, sort of propaganda machine. They did an amazing job at parroting this narrative. Their propaganda was amazing. I mean, if you really want to know what it's like, it's more of an extreme example, but you can see it. Just go Google North Korea and look at how these people look at the Kim Jong-un. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's who it is. And the Kim dynasty in general. I mean, I saw this clip, and I'm using this, kind of bringing some modern day in this. And man, we're only 34 minutes into this. We are not going to get through this today. I am trying. I really am, folks. I hope this is not boring you, but I'm trying to get to this. It's important. So, but if you Google North Korea now, and you'll see the propaganda, what they have done. In fact, you can go back, and if you study a little bit about North Korea, you see that they actually intentionally did this. They created the Kim dynasty to be divine. And so there was this documentary you can find on YouTube. I think it was a National Geographic documentary where basically this there's this airplane that they've outfitted to be able to do cataract surgery. And they took this plane to North Korea, and they got permission with the North Korean government. And they were doing basic cataract surgery on people in North Korea that were actually blind, but just needed this corrective surgery, and they could see. And so they bring them all into a room, and they all have bandages on, right? And they're all sitting there, and they start taking the bandages off. And their reaction, the doctors were there, and all those had performed the surgery were there, but their reaction was they were in the front of the room. They were all sitting in rows. In the front of the room, there was a picture of the Kims. And when the first thing when they took their bandages off, the first thing they would come down. Usually the person who got the surgery and their family would come down to the front of the room, and they would literally fall down and worship. Oh, great. Supreme, I think they call him the supreme leader. You're worthy. We're so honored. I mean, it was just, and you look at that, go, man, whoa, that's a little, wow. How could you live like that? That's the world that they were living in then when Jesus showed up. That was the world. Take that. That's the world. Because the propaganda machine was making this out to Octavian was not just the leader. He was God. And it wasn't just like, oh, he's God. No, it was actually believed he was actually divine. And so they even told the story that the 1,000-year story of Rome, as long as sort of this sort of story of the 1,000 years and this golden age began sort of with the birth of a new child who would bring peace and prosperity to the whole world. And there was this poet by the name of Virgil. He created this song, and the song there was a line in the song that said, "The whole world is now being renewed." And what's amazing about this, later on, some Christians saw that line written by the poet Virgil about the coming age of the divineness of the Roman Empire. They looked at it as sort of a pagan prophecy of the coming Messiah. And in fact, not trying to be a little, not to get on this today, but just it's worth throwing this out there. The fathers of the American Constitution actually borrowed a phrase from that poem. And there's a phrase in that same poem that says, a new order of the ages. And not only is it put on the Great Seal of the United States, but also on the dollar bill. And basically, it's kind of saying that history turned its vital corner, not only with Augustus Caesar or even Jesus of Nazareth, but they were kind of anointing the fact that all of history turned on the birth of the Constitution of the United States. I'll just leave it at that. You can go research it. If you don't believe me, it's there. Just look up a new order of the ages, U.S. seal, dollar bill, and look at the origins of where that came from and the fact what it was referring to. And it's basically, you have to surmise that they were basically saying the Constitution was as world-changing as the entrance of a birth of a new child that would bring this sort of peace and prosperity. And so this poem by Virgil talks about this new age where everything one could require will be produced by the earth under the divine kingship. Nobody knows which child he was referring to, but the point's clear. And the point is this: the new age is here at last through the peaceful and joyful rule of Augustus Caesar. That's what's sort of the tagline that they used. And this message was spread worldwide. And this is the message. This is exactly how they phrase. I'm using this because I want you to see the parallel here. This is how it was phrased. Good news. Good news. If you know anything about the Bible, you know that where does that come from, right? Jesus came to proclaim the good news. We call it the gospel. It's the good news. Well, guess what? They were using that already. Good news. We have an emperor, justice, peace, security, prosperity as our fathers. The Son of God has become the King of the world. That was not written about Jesus. That was not written by the prophets of Israel. That was not written by the disciples. That was written by the propaganda machine of the Roman Empire before Jesus showed up on the scene. Bet you didn't know that. Get that. That was what the propaganda machine of Rome was already pumping out throughout the empire. Good news, we have an emperor. Justice, peace, security, prosperity are ours forever. And then the tagline, the Son of God became the King of the world. Whoa! This is the storm Jesus walked into. Can you imagine? I mean, we always talk about the fact when he said he was the Son of God, what it meant from the Jewish perspective. What was he saying to the Romans? Goodness gracious. Now you know why the message of Jesus became so antagonistic through the Roman Empire. It wasn't just this little docile message of, oh, follow this guy out of Nazareth. He's just this peaceful man. It was saying, follow Jesus. He's the Son of God. No, time out. You're wrong. He is not the Son of God. We have a Son of God. No. That's a false Son of God. He ain't the real thing. He's a man. This guy's the real Son of God. No wonder the Christians were they had the Jews trying to kill him because they were saying Jesus was the Son of God. And they had the Romans trying to kill him because they believed Jesus was the Son of God. And stuck right in the middle of all this was Jesus himself. So Augustus ruled Rome. He was one of the longest rulers in Rome. Again, I have a tendency to go a little deep here because I love this stuff. So I'm going to try to make it a little, I'm trying to skim through here, because I don't want to get too deep, because I want to try to get to the point of this. So Augustus ruled from like 31 BC to about 14 AD. Like obviously the birth of Jesus was kind of right in the middle of that, around anywhere from 5 BC to 0 AD. We don't know exactly, but in that. And after his death, he was given divine. He was put in a class of forever divinity. And his successor, Tiberius, took the same titles. So it didn't go away. It was just passed on. And today we could call it a power move. But when Tiberius took over, his coin has the abbreviated title Augustus Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, on the front. And on the picture, Tiberius, this is the picture of the Roman coin. Get it? Roman coin. This was something that Jesus would have been circulating the time of Jesus. Tiberius is dressed as a priest with the title Pontificus Maximus on the other side of the coin. It was a coin like this one that they showed to Jesus. And to get this is why this is important. You got a coin with Tiberius dressed as a priest, saying he is the son of the divine Augustus, which then made him the son of God, with the title Pontificus Maximus. And they hand this coin to Jesus when they ask him whether they should pay tribute to Caesar. You mean to tell me he wasn't in the eye of the storm? You know what I love about that, though? Jesus was so awesome. Did he lose it? Did he say, how can you give me this coin? Why do you dare put this in my hand? Do you know that this coin is blasphemous? It's false? He didn't say that. He's like, give to Caesar that which is Caesar, and unto God that which is God. Boom, drop the mic. If you would hand a Christian a coin, I'm going to use this, okay? If you would hand, and I'm only using current names because it's current. I'm not making a political statement. Can we all understand what I'm saying? Can we all go there? This is not that podcast. This is just Jesus. But if I handed most Christians a coin today that said, Joe Biden, Son of God, and I handed it, you would literally feel like your hand was melting off and you were going straight to hell. How can I touch this? It is soiled. This is blasphemous. And Jesus is like, give Caesar that which is Caesar, unto God that which is God. Again, that's why I'm saying you got to look at the storm Jesus walked into, folks, because I'm telling you, if you start looking at what he walked into, you kind of look at the world we're living in today going, you know what? A, number one, we don't have that many problems that we think. And B, if Jesus was here, he would not be doing stuff like we think he'd be doing. I don't think Jesus would be down at the White House going, listen, move over, Joe. And Donald, you don't have a chance. I'm the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. And so on top of this, you had this other part, and this is sort of the end of the story, the Roman side of it. You have Rome, and they needed the Middle East because they had this urgent need for raw materials, and mainly grain, because the city of Rome, which was the eternal city, the holy place for the Romans, it was overpopulated and underemployed, and so grain shipments in from Egypt were vital for their existence, and in order to sort of avoid piracy and sort of hostile actions that ultimately would disrupt the supply chain, it was vital to keep the whole area stable. So that's why the Roman governor in a place like Jerusalem had to keep the peace, sort of was tasked with administering justice, collecting taxes, and the biggest thing was to suppress unrest, because don't mess with the supply chain. We've got to keep the city fed. And the whole propaganda system insisted that the rule of Caesar, the Roman sort of son of God, right, was the good news. This was what was parroted. It was I'm going to say that again, right? The rule of Caesar, the son of God, was good news because it had brought blessing and benefits to the whole world. Can you say that again? They were told that the rule of Caesar and the fact that he was the son of God was good news. So once the locals saw that the blessings of Rome was so generously offering, they would kind of happily come into line. That was sort of the point of the propaganda. If you guys see what we're doing for you, you're not gonna fuss. And this is sort of the Western storm that Jesus is walking into. This is the first element of the perfect storm that Jesus finds himself right in the middle. So if you thought the Jewish part of this storm was bad, yes, it was, and we're going to get to that. But the Roman part of the storm was legit. So come back next time, and we're going to explore the Jewish side of this. And then we're going to talk about what's the third element, because the perfect storm had three elements. What was the third element? We're going to talk about what that element was. And then we're going to talk about how Jesus navigated this perfect storm and why does that matter to us today. So this is going to be a little longer one. And instead of you having to listen to me for 5 hours, we're going to break this up. And so again, using the metaphor of the perfect storm, we're going to build on that. And we're going to take it step by step. And we're going to show you the perfect storm Jesus walked into. And the perfect storm had three elements. We talked about the first element, the Roman Empire. And I guarantee you today, you did not know the Roman Empire was like that. Maybe you did, but some of you didn't. So again, the Roman Empire was a major factor in all this stuff. In the language that we see in the Gospels, it was not just inflammatory towards the Jews. It was inflammatory towards the Romans. So that was one part of the storm. Next week, we're going to talk about the Jewish side, which was increasingly just as bad. In fact, that was the one we see the most played out in the Gospels. But again, it was all in the backdrop of the Roman. And then we're going to blow in, and maybe we'll get to it next week. We're going to kind of add the third element in. The third, and I'll keep what that third element is, because some of you are like, what was the third element? If Rome was one and Jews the other, who was the third? Hint, it was not the Pharisees. No, Pharisees are always a part of it. But the point I'm making is you're going to see these three converging storms that came right at the time of Jesus. But you're going to really see the message of who Jesus is just jump out at you. You're going to go, wow, Jesus entered the world at that time and he navigated that. And that's how he was. Man, what an amazing God he was. Number one, he chose that period of time, but he chose to navigate it in such a wonderful, beautiful, and humble way. So you got to come back next week. That's the best teaser I can give you. If you're not hooked yet, I don't know how to hook you, because next week you got to come back. You got to find out what the rest of the storm is, right? You can't just stop here. You know, the Roman side. Let's come back and hear the rest. So next week, as always, if you would do this, like this, share this, subscribe. I love the feedback. Real quickly here, I was going to mention this in the beginning of this episode, and I forgot to do that. We kind of jumped into it. But if you are still listening, thank you for hanging on this long. But
thank you for all the positive feedback. I will say it's been a while since I've done something that has received this much positive feedback, as I am getting from all of you that are telling me how wonderful this podcast has been and how much you have enjoyed listening. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that tremendously. And please continue to share. It really does. I do it. I love hearing the fact that it's making a positive impact. And not only that, but many of you are listening that I don't even know who you are. And people are sharing this with you and you're listening to it. And it's been wonderful to hear all the wonderful responses that have happened so far. So we're just going to continue. It's no more complicated than that. It's just Jesus, right? Why make it hard? It's just Jesus. So we're going to keep talking about Jesus, and trust me, you're like, how can we just keep talking about Jesus? Trust me, the subject of Jesus is inexhaustible. So we have plenty to go, tons of content. So thanks for coming along on this journey. Just Jesus. Until next time, come back and see us next week. We continue the story of the perfect storm. Until then, God bless.